your category 2 part of your brain started to go offline, and therefore it was almost like you had an inability to truly feel fear. Is that right?
Yes. I was very fortunate that the area of my brain that had the hemorrhage was my emotional fear. And so I was curious. I was more curious about what was happening to me. People say, well, was it an advantage for you that you were a neuroanatomist? And it was like, not on the morning of the stroke.
So today's guest is someone who, in no uncertain terms, has changed my life with her books. There's not many books that I can quite honestly say, yeah, this book absolutely changed my life. There was before this book and after this book. And both of Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor's books did that for me. I'll explain in a moment why. But Jill Bolte Taylor is a Harvard-trained and published neuroanatomist who, on one fateful day, ended up having a stroke that essentially left half of her brain impaired. It simply went offline. Now, for many people who imagine going through that, you would think it was hell. But for her, she basically entered a state of nirvana. Through this story, she ended up getting the first ever viral TED Talk. And if you watch that TED Talk, which I highly recommend you do, you will absolutely see why it would have gone viral. Her story is nothing short of extraordinary. Now, this podcast was all about the idea of exploring ancient wisdom and modern science and trying to really find the overlap in between. I'm not sure anyone knows the answers, but if we find enough points out there, at some point I'm sure we can find the overlap. And so Dr. Jill Bolte Taylor's wisdom is just something worth taking note of. Speaking just very candidly, this woman was so much fun to have a conversation with. Her energy is just second to none, and her story of recovery is just extraordinary. My only regret of this interview is that we couldn't make it last like 3 to 4 hours, because it was just great. One of the ways that her books was able to change my life, and I touch on this very briefly in the podcast, was that just over a year and a half ago, I ended up getting severe jet lag. And for the first time in about 12 years, I started to have an anxiety again. Something that I didn't think was possible, very naively. And it was her books that helped me really understand what's going on in the brain. So often, in the world of social media, especially with influencers, people speaking about hardcore science and people speaking about spirituality, it's very easy to feel like you're supposed to just take one way and go in one direction to become uber spiritual, to become uber successful, as opposed to understanding that in the brain there is a balance. Your brain literally kind of wants both, and best of all, there is a way to get them. And that's exactly what we explore in this podcast, the idea as to what's really going on. What is it the brain really wants from you? Why is it that you actually do the things that you do? For anyone who feels stuck in any area of their life, and frankly anyone who wants to live through life with a greater state of harmony, this is the podcast to listen to, without a shadow of a doubt. So without further ado, let's get stuck in. Jill, it's fantastic to finally be able to speak to you. How are you doing today?
I'm well. How are you, Scott?
Yeah, very well indeed. Like I said, I've been looking forward to this for a very long time. So I think we're going to have a great conversation. Jill, you came to into my universe when I had a very peculiar feeling to go into a library one day, and I picked up a book called The Energy Codes. And I read the foreword and I thought, oh, I came for one thing, and now I want to know who this lady is. And so I ended up finding your viral TED Talk, obviously one of the first viral TED Talks, I think, that went viral in, I want to say 2008, I might be wrong.
Yeah.
And I've read hundreds and hundreds of books over the years, and it's very, very rare that I will find a book of one author, my stroke of insight, and the same day that I finish it, go and start reading the second book as well. And so
Love it.
I thought it would be wonderful to maybe just start all of this with that wonderful magical date, December the 10th, 1996. Maybe you could open up to explain why that was such a pivotal day in your life.
Yes. So I was, the day before that, I was teaching and performing research at Harvard Medical School. I'm a trained neuroanatomist, so I care about the anatomy of the brain. And I was teaching medical students about how the brain organizes information at a cellular level. So that was the day before. And then I woke up on the morning of December 10, 1996, and I was experiencing a major hemorrhage in the left hemisphere of my brain. And over the course of 4 hours, I watched my own brain go offline circuit by circuit. And the TED Talk that you mentioned, I take you moment by moment by moment through the experience through the eyes of a neuroscientist experiencing a stroke. And after that 4 hours, I could not walk, talk, read, write, or recall any of my life. I became a complete infant in a woman's body. And through the eyes of a scientist, it was really quite a fascinating experience because as I was having a symptom, like paralysis in the right hemisphere, in the right arm, I knew exactly which cells had gone offline. So as a scientist, I was mapping what's going on with me because I'm a neuroanatomist. I'm a researcher, not a neurologist who has a lot of relationship with stroke survivors. So, I knew what a stroke was. I taught what a stroke was, the symptoms and signs of stroke, but I didn't have a whole lot of experience as a person who knew people with stroke. So it took a while for me to figure it out what the problem was. And it wasn't until paralysis of my right arm where I realized, oh my gosh, I'm having a stroke. I'm having a stroke. And the next thing my brain says is, wow, this is so cool. How many brain scientists have the opportunity to witness and watch their own brain have this process of deterioration? So it was a severe stroke by the end of that 4 hours, and I did get help clearly, but then it took 8 years for me to completely recover all function from that experience.
Yes. And with that, I think again that there's the hero of all that story, which is also Gigi, who
Yeah,
is your mother, who literally nursed you for the second time, almost back to from infancy back to being an adult whose left hemisphere came back online. And
yes.
am I right in thinking that the experience of watching those circuits go offline, that it wasn't that scary because and we'll go into this sort of in the near future, your category 2 part of your brain started to go offline, and therefore it was almost like you had an inability to truly feel fear. Is that right?
Yes, yes, I was very fortunate that the area of my brain that had the hemorrhage was my emotional fear, and so I was curious. I was more curious about what was happening to me, and I'm people say, well, was it an advantage for you that you were a neuroanatomist? And it was like, it not on the morning of the stroke. On the morning of the stroke, it would have been better if I had a problem and I walked out into the street, or I went downstairs and where my landlord lived and knocked on the door and said, I'm having a problem, I need help, before I had this high level of deterioration. But because I was so curious and I was watching this phenomenon, I mean, really through the eyes of a scientist, wow. I mean, this was like bringing to life everything that I taught and everything that's written in books about stroke and how the brain organizes information. So for me, it was just fascinating. And I probably I could have gotten help sooner and it would have been better off. But I do think I had an advantage for the recovery. Because after brain surgery, the surgeons had to go in and remove a blood clot the size of a golf ball, take the pressure off that left hemisphere, and then it was just, now the brain can go back to what its normality is, and I can begin the process of recovering. And I do believe I had a tremendous advantage because I still had in my right hemisphere a three-dimensional understanding of my brain, of my body. Even though I had no language for my left hemisphere, I still had a roadmap, if you will, to what recovery meant, what was the goal, and how do I do that at a cellular level.
Interesting. And so I know that the first book is dedicated really to that experience and what's happening in the brain. But could you just give sort of the listeners maybe that 30,000-foot view of what it's like literally having your left hemisphere go offline?
Yes, when you consider what are there's two basic differences from my experience between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere. The right hemisphere is the present moment. It has no past, it has no future. The left hemisphere has this linearity of time. And so we have a past experience, we have a future experience. And then the other difference is that there's also a group of cells in the left hemisphere that is an ego. It defines me. I am Jill Bolte Taylor. I have blonde hair, blue eyes. I live in Bloomington, Indiana. Here's my phone number. Here's my likes and my dislikes. Here's my credentials. Here's my academics. Here's my relationship to the external world. That's the left hemisphere. But in the absence of all that information about me, the individual, I no longer have the physical boundaries of where I begin and end. So I perceive myself as an energy ball in space. And as that energy ball, I have no boundaries, and all I have is the present moment. I don't have a past, I don't have a future, because there's no linearity of time, which is why these two hemispheres, it's so great that we have both, because the right hemisphere is fantastic as it is, being big as the universe, being connected to all that is, having this deep sense of inner love. Who doesn't want that? But it is a completely non-functional state of being. You have to have that left hemisphere that says, I am an individual. This is my identity. These are the details of my life. And I can take the mass of what I am as this magnificent collection of cells and have an identity and functional in the external world. So we end up with these two completely different ways of perceiving the world. And when my left hemisphere went offline, Jill Bolte Taylor, she died that day, and her education was gone, her relationship to the past and the future. I had no idea what a mother was, much less who my mother was. Everything of my past was gone, and all that I had was, I literally felt as though the energy of what I was blended with the energy of all that is. I was as big as the universe. I shared in the consciousness of that energetic, and all I had was the present moment. And in that experience of all that is a knowing. And in that knowing is an understanding that I am this magnificent life force power of the universe, concentrated in this biological form. And the miracle of what we are as living beings is like, wow, it's just a phenomenon that, most of us don't spend a whole lot of time going, wow, oh my God, I'm alive, right? I'm alive. I'm in this 50 trillion beautiful molecular geniuses all working together. So I have this organism I can see with eyes that can filter that information, and I can hear sound and the data that processes, and I have motor skills that allow me to move into the world, and I have fine dexterity so I can actually manipulate the world. And at that level, we're just all a big wow. And I really wish more people spend a little more time in the big wow, because if we had that level of appreciation and gratitude simply because we exist at all, we would be functioning in a completely different world.
Yes. And so it really did sound, I think you also referenced a few of the books and also some studies that really looked at this, that by being locked really in that right hemisphere, it was like you were living in a state of pretty much nirvana, enlightenment, for around about 8 months before things started to come back online. Is that right?
Well, I existed as a fluid. I perceived myself. See, I have to have a left hemisphere that defines the boundaries of where I begin and where I end in order to say I am a solid. I'm a solid individual, and these are the boundaries of me, and I am separate from you. And that's how our left brain organizes information in the world, including ourselves. And it was 8 years before I perceived myself to be something other than a fluid. So for that long, I existed in this consciousness where I was a fluid in a fluid environment, which really makes sense because we are fluid in a fluid environment of the atoms and molecules of the cosmos. But when one perceives themselves in that way, they live their life in relationship with everything as opposed to up against everything. And when you realize that the universe is melded as a part of you, you interact with that space very differently.
Yes. And there are some things that you've mentioned there that I have specific questions around. But before jumping way into this, because this is the stuff that I thought, if there's anyone that can answer this in the world, it's the woman I'm speaking to. So I had some really specific questions for you that I want to delve into. But before that, just to add some context to my questions, could we delve in just a little bit into whole brain living and what that is? And maybe we can explain the categories so people have a bit of an overview as to what we'd be discussing in a moment.
Yes, sure. So most of us have an understanding that the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere process information in different ways. But when you look at the anatomy of the brain, we have the brain stem, and the brain stem has bilaterality. It has a right and a left, but that's mostly for on-off switches. This is the reptilian brain. I'm hungry, I eat, I'm satisfied, the switch turns off. So simple things like that. And then new tissue gets added on top of that brainstem level. And that's the difference between a reptile and a mammal, is the addition of this new tissue called the limbic tissue. And the limbic tissue is emotional or experiential tissue. And then on top of that, the difference between a typical mammal and a human is the added on tissue above that of the higher cognitive thinking tissue. And the way that biology works is new tissue gets added on, and then all the kinks get worked out between that and the tissue below, so it becomes streamlined. And then that new tissue has new tissue added on top of it that then will regulate and modulate the tissue below it. So there's this ongoing progression of the addition of new tissue. So we humans have emotional, experiential tissue in our right and our left hemisphere, our limbic tissue. And then we also have thinking tissue in our right and our left hemispheres. So when I experienced my stroke, and I care about anatomy, I care about the cells, I think in terms of cells and circuits. And when I lost my left hemisphere, the hemorrhage wiped out both the emotional tissue and the thinking tissue of that left hemisphere. So in the absence of a left hemisphere, the fibers going over to the right hemisphere inhibiting those cells got all offline. And so all I had was a functional right hemisphere. And I had the emotional experiential portion of that, as well as the thinking cognitive portion of that. And what I realized was I had two very different characters inside of this right hemisphere. I had a character that is the what I call character 3, the right emotional tissue. And that tissue is creative and open and expansive and curious and entrepreneurial and innovative and open-ended, and it's inclusive. That's that character profile. And then the character profile of the right thinking tissue was the part that I described earlier, which is simply at awe that I exist at all. And the wonder that I'm connected to this universe and to this body. And oh my God, I'm alive. But in order to have the experience of those two characters, what was I missing were two other characters. And the two other characters was the left thinking tissue, which I call character 1, the left thinking, which is analytical, and it has hierarchy, and it analyzes right and wrong and good and bad, and it creates boundaries, and it is this portion of our brain that has no emotion. It's simply 1 + 1 = 2. And there's no emotion about 1 + 1 = 2. And then there's what I call the character 2, which is the emotional tissue of that left hemisphere. And that is an amazing part of who we are. And it's at the anatomical cellular level. And stop and think that the left hemisphere has linearity across time. So it has a past and it has a future. How does that happen? Just the phenomenon of, it's one thing for me to be alive in the present moment, processing information in the present moment, and I'm stimulated toward things and repelled against other things. But how on earth does a group of cells in the human brain step out of the present moment and relate information coming in about the present moment to our past experience? I mean, this is life. This is the wonder, one of the wonders of what we are as living beings. And it's this little character two group of cells. But at the same time, it's a filter for emotion. So it comes in, information streams in, it goes into the right hemisphere, little character three, that says, okay, I'm right here, right now, having an experience. What does it feel like in the present moment? But the character two, emotional tissue in the left hemisphere, is saying, how do I feel about this based on my past experience? And so and this is going to be my alarm, alert, I don't feel safe information. So it's going to shut down when things don't feel familiar, and I get scared, or I feel fear, or I erupt in rage, and to push away from something that doesn't feel familiar and doesn't feel safe. So we end up with these four very specific characters based on the anatomy of our brain, and they all have incredible value. And when we experience either a cognitive or an emotional conflict, what we're really doing is the different characters inside of these four different parts of our brain are actually having different values and wanting different things, and therefore are in conflict, because the right hemisphere is going to care about the collective whole of the we, and the left hemisphere is going to care about the egocentric me. So it's beautiful. Our brain is this absolutely beautiful construct that when we get to know and we can differentiate these four different parts inside of ourselves, then we can gain the power to choose who and how we want to be in any moment, and experience an ongoing sense of inner peace because we're not in conflict.
Yes. I remember the first time I ever heard the analogy of there being lots of different parts, almost like your brain is more like a company trying to move towards a goal than it is just this individual idea. I think it was maybe Incognito by David Eagleman. Um, but it was your book, Whole Brain Living, that really seemed to take that concept to a whole new level, and it was more of a user's manual of, okay, now that we know that we're steering a company,
right?
How do we actually get the balance? And just for context, Jill, this book was so helpful for me at the time because I hadn't had any anxiety or depression for about 12 years. And then I ended up, some reason, having the most horrendous bout of jet lag towards the beginning of last year. And I was severely sleep deprived. And what was beginning to happen to me is I was starting to naturally, if anyone has 4 hours of sleep in 40 hours and then has 2 hours of sleep the next recurring night, my character too was starting to go into overdrive. The problem was I didn't realize that. I thought that I was actually maybe having some sort of Kundalini awakening. And I was terrified at the idea that I was just going to lose my mind and lose myself. And it turns out that I was just sleep deprived, and my character too was in overdrive, just constantly trying to say, hey, are you okay? Oh, what's that sensation in your body? Wait, that might be related to what happened there. Wait, are you going to have a Kundalini awakening? And so it was really, I looked at lots of different tools, but it was your book that really allowed me to recognize, dude, you're okay. It's just your character too. But that moves me on to the point that I really was eager to have this conversation with about, as people start to, you put it perfectly in the book, that we just live in a very left brain dominant society. That's just kind of how we're raised and kind of where we're steered. And what seems to be happening more so than ever at the moment, just because of the access of information, is suddenly there's new aspects of spiritual movements that are starting to spread. And slowly, I think we're getting a little bit more balanced. I don't think we're quite there yet, but it's definitely, it feels like with social media, despite all its issues, it's spreading certain knowledge that's allowing people to move back to center. But something that you hear a lot about is something like a Kundalini awakening. But you also have things like schizophrenia, and which I know you're an absolute expert on. And so I wondered if you had an idea or a distinction as to, one, if Kundalini awakenings are genuinely real, because I feel like if anyone's going to know that, it would be with you, with the experience that you've had and the other people that you've worked with. But how does that differ to schizophrenia?
So schizophrenia, I'm going to say, is more of a wiring, which is why it's a long-term problem. And if with schizophrenia, so this is a physical brain disorder in the way the cells are wired to one another. I'll give you an example of how the brain of people with schizophrenia is different from normal. And if what they're perceiving is different, there's no way that they can have a normal perception of reality, because their normal is now skewed to what they process. So something like 86% of people diagnosed with schizophrenia have a alteration in the way they process visual information. So if you have a moving target, a normal brain is going to jump in front and then on, in front and then on the target, in front and then on. So it's got this natural progression, this natural trajectory. Many people with schizophrenia will have a big jump in front and then behind, and then in front and then behind, which means the raw data, at the level of the raw data of how their information is being processed, is skewed automatically at the level of input. So if the input is being processed, is different, there's no way to normalize that perception of reality, but they're still going to process information and have belief systems, but they tend to believe different things than the normal brain processes because the data was different. So that's a physical brain experience. When you think about Kundalini, this is more of an energetic jump. So if we have 4 groups of cells, those cells are matter, they're substance, and they communicate by electrical phenomenon. And the electrical phenomenon is a flip-flop between different atoms across the electrical system. And in order for that to happen, the external environment between the cells has to be very highly maintained chemically in order for this flip-flop to be able to happen. So all of that is to say that in the normal information processing, it's a matter of atoms and molecules and energy. And if energy, let's say you're extremely tired and you've been jet lagged and you've been sleep deprived for a week. And now, first of all, the cells, the space between the cells, what sleep does is it's when the garbage cleaners come in and clean out all the waste, right? Because here you have 800 billion neurons, multiply that by 10, and you have the number of glial cells packaging those up. And these are little eating and pooping creatures, right? So they're eating their molecules and they're creating waste, and they're putting the waste in the space between the cells. And so as you're sleep deprived, you're going to have this buildup of waste between these cells so that you're not going to have this flip-flop of the environment clean in order for there to be normal information processing. At which point, things change. And as things change, if all we are is energy and molecules, if right now I'm speaking, so the energy and the blood flow in my brain is going mostly to that left thinking tissue so that I have language and I'm picking information out from other parts of my brain. But most of this I've talked about a lot. So it's all kind of running on automatic in that portion of my brain. But the part of my brain that is like connected to all that is, it's running, but it's running in the background. Right. So it's not where my focus is. It's not where my energy goes. Well, when we're having different kinds of mindset experiences or energetic experiences, essentially the energy in the brain and body is being routed in different ways to different parts in order to have different experiences. Okay. But for most people, these are going to be short term and a phenomenon that then can fuel your normal processing once you've gone to sleep, allowed the garbage cleaners to come in and clean out the waste so that the brain fog, if you will, goes away and you have clarity again.
Okay, interesting. So if someone, so you described it really beautifully neurologically there. If someone subjectively is starting to experience something and they're wondering, is this the Kundalini experience that I've heard about, or have I just lost my mind?
Right.
Subjectively, what would be the difference makers that you would say, look for this, and this is probably more of a difficult episode, and this here is more of a Kundalini awakening. Subjectively, what should they be looking out for, do you think?
Well, first of all, I think it's important that we trust our brain. And
Okay.
if we are, it's terrifying because in the Kundalini experiences, as well as other experiences, it's a melting of the ego group of cells. And that's terrifying because the ego is all about self-preservation. And if you're going to dissolve that tiny little group of cells in my left hemisphere that says, I am an individual, I begin and end here, this is my name, these are the data that I package as me, to give that up is a form of death to the ego. So you got a group of cells that has rooted now in all of this fear. Oh my God, what's happening? Well, whatever's going to happen is going to happen. So you might as well go with the ride, first of all. And I mean, really, what are you going to do? You're just going to not enjoy the phenomenon of the experience. And if you go insane, you're going to go insane anyway. Let it go. Let it go. The gripping makes everything harder and worse and no fun. So if you're having now on top of it though, you started out saying to me, I was sleep deprived. I was deep sleep deprived all week. I was uncomfortable. I was experiencing anxiety. You know, all of that. So you probably know you're not going insane, but your cells are sleep deprived, and your system, your nervous system, is going to function differently than it would when it has sleep. You know, there's a magnificent book called Why We Sleep. I encourage the whole world to read this book because we sleep because we need it. And for people who say we don't need sleep, you know, what's going on inside of those brains? Well, we know what's going on inside of those brains. So you need to clean out the waste, and sleep allows the entire internal system. I mean, if you're looking at 50 trillion people, that's what? That's a lot. There are only what, 8-9 billion people on the planet. But imagine 50 trillion of us. At some point, you got to go in and clean out the waste, right? Or we're going to have chaos and illness and no clarity. So I think that if you allowed yourself at that moment to follow the experience without the fear, with the absence of the fear, and the support of the rest of your brain saying, what will be, let's take this little ride inside. Now, that's very different. You're going to hear me say something completely different about the psychedelic journey. Because for people who are putting a psychedelic into their brain, the phenomenon, the experience is going to be kind of like I just described. You're going to have this complete shift in which cells are going to be functioning. But the brain's response to psychedelic drugs is neurogenesis and neuroplasticity, which is the brain's response to trauma. So there's a difference between putting a molecule in and stirring a trauma at the level of the cells versus finding this kind of awakening, open experience as an energetic being as big as the universe at a natural level. So, you know, we're just very complex beings.
Well, that there, Jill, is why I've been looking forward to having this conversation so much, because my entire curiosity, especially for the last several years, probably about a decade, has been just wondering what the hell is going on. And being fascinated in both those camps, the spiritual side, the side of the neuroscience as well, and just trying to work out what and where and why that bridge is, which is why your experience is so wonderful and unique considering your background and the experience that you had, right? But what I find is that it's very difficult to, and I'm sure you know what I mean here, it's just very difficult to be able to find not the truth, because I don't think anyone really knows the truth, whatever that is even supposed to mean,
Yeah.
but try to find what certain things mean, because that meaning is so subjective. And so very often I feel like, had I gone to someone who came from a very spiritual background and
Mhm.
explained my concern, they
Right.
may have said, it's let the energy flow, let it go here. Had I
Right.
gone to,
A
an MD,
psychiatrist.
yeah, psychiatrist, they say, for goodness sake, go to sleep. You'll be all right.
Right.
And that's that. Even though I think that there's a place for both.
No.
I've taken ayahuasca many years ago, and once was more than enough. And I've heard you in other interviews also say you've really got to be careful, because the
Gotta be
entire
careful.
time there are some people who say it's drugs in the brain, and you really don't know what you're signing up for. And other people are saying, no, you don't understand. It's a medicine. It's you always get what you're supposed to have. And what are your thoughts on something like that?
Well, I think that you ought to look at the source. And if you're talking to people who are drinking the Kool-Aid, they're going to give you the Kool-Aid. And if you're talking to people who aren't drinking the Kool-Aid, they're going to raise a cautionary voice. And it's a plant, yet it and here's where I like to send people is, all the research right now, it's fantastic. I'm so glad that they're doing research, legitimate research on the psychedelics. I think it's important. I think that it's important that the flags of caution were raised during the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, because otherwise we were going to ride the psychedelics on top of the 60s. And the 60s in the US was anything goes, right? And so there wasn't the voice of reason. We needed all of it. We need the rational, structured, analytical brain involved. And hopefully the scientists now are doing more with that. However, even if you look at the research, and there's not that much research going on, but if you look at the research and you go to these websites and you look at the inclusive things you have to have in order to participate in research, and the exclusionary attributes of things that if you have any of these things, you don't qualify, a very large percentage of the population doesn't qualify for the research. And so anybody with a severe mental illness, well, current statistics in the US are 25% of people are going to, at some point in their life, have a psychiatric issue. 25%. Okay, that means my brain is now vulnerable to information processing in one way or another. Add addictions on top of that, add family members of these people on top of that. And pretty soon you've got about 60% of the population shouldn't be anywhere near one of these psychedelic drugs, according to the researchers, right? And this is just according to the researchers. And then let's say there's 20% of the population that we would call healthy. Well, they don't want that experience because they're already feeling healthy and they're happy with their lives. They're having a more of a whole brain experience. They're not having a lot of internal conflict. They're at peace. They're living productive lives. They're feeling balanced, and they're making a positive contribution personally and into the world. So that leaves a very small percentage of the population who actually should be or could be possibly included in the psychedelics. Well, that's not what's happening right now. Right now, it's like, oh, the Wild West of the psychedelic journey. And you've got people from strict research all the way to, yeah, let's go get high because I poured a mushroom, out in the woods, and everything in between. And to me, why I care about this as a cautionary voice is you have one brain. You have one beautiful brain. And you are you because of how your brain cells function. And if you literally, and this is in all the data from the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, a third of the cases of severe mental illness are induced by the psychedelics. And that's because a psychedelic, one of the characteristics of schizophrenia in particular, is hallucination plus delusion makes schizophrenia. hallucination is usually part of the psychedelic hallucinogenic experience. That's circuitry inside of your brain. So you take this psychedelic drug, it stimulates the hallucinating circuitry, and then you get off the drug because time passes, but you don't get the memo. The brain cells don't get the memo to turn off hallucinating. So you continue to hallucinate. And this is a real neurological cellular circuitry phenomenon. And so we end up with this epidemic of people who are now diagnosed with schizophrenia because they took psychedelics and the brain cells didn't get the memo to turn it off. And the world of neurology has no idea how to turn that off. So it's devastating to these people. And it's not just at this point the hallucinogenic psychedelics, but cannabis. The new cannabis is not the stuff we were smoking in the 60s and 70s, right? This stuff is so potent now, and part of it has a hallucinogenic factor. And so right now there is a new epidemic in the States for people smoking cannabis for schizophrenic symptoms of hallucination and delusion, and it's devastating. But people aren't talking about that. Instead, it's like, oh yeah, it's fine. Let's just go do that. And it's like, no, you need to come into this more informed, because you get one precious brain. And if you blow it, you've blown it. And then you're not going to live the life you thought you'd live.
Yeah. I know those are such wise words. I remember a couple of years ago, I had my, I've only tried anything like that a handful of times in my life. And it was a couple of years ago where I had an experience, the tiniest amount of psilocybin, and I had that wonderful realization of, but I bloody love my brain the way that it is, and I want to keep it like that. And so I barely drink alcohol nowadays.
You know, it's
A can Maltese
precious.
enough.
These cells are so precious. And if we get that message, good for you for getting that message. And I've had so many people now who have done ayahuasca, and they'd say, I'd go back twice a year or once a year to kind of get the reboot. But now with whole brain living, I don't have to, because now I have tools that can integrate my 4 characters. So my experience with the ayahuasca is now sustainable without it. And it's like, now I have a whole different perspective of my precious brain, and how beautiful all parts of it are, and how I can work with it as a collective whole without these drugs.
Yes. And I think that there's almost a false fallacy in certain spiritual traditions that it's almost like the goal is to shut off different parts of the brain to live in one space. And I remember hearing the idea, the concept first from Jamie Wheel from the Flow Genome Project. And he gave a really interesting definition for enlightenment, which is the ability to bring the state, the emotions, the thoughts necessary for the environment that you're in. And I'd never really heard that before. And then your book was just all of that on steroids. I was saying, no, all those parts, they're all beautiful in their own way. And you want to be able to bring each of those parts. It's just you want to be able to have more control and the ability to jump in between those parts. That's where that's where the power was.
Yeah,
And so,
the power to choose moment by moment who and how you want to be, regardless of your external circumstances. That's the power we have inside. But as soon as I give that power to a drug or to an external, then it's like, how is that not just another level of dependency? I want people to be really free. And to me, freedom is this ability to know that you have this power to choose, and you can choose, and you do, and you live that life conflict free, because you know who's talking to who inside.
yes. So if we go back to the book, just towards the end of Stroke of Insight, and also a few chapters into Whole Brain Living, I love the book because as I'm reading, generally I'm going to be very category 1 dominated, and you're talking about all different aspects of the brain, and my category 1 is going, yeah, parts of the brain, and I can put those in the compartments.
Yummy.
Absolutely. And then you start to make some statements that is very much designed for that category 4. And I noticed by category 1 going, hey, well, what's going on here? What's she saying? And so I want to go through some of these statements with you, and I'd love you to unpack those for me, because they're beautifully written. But my category 1 was going,
but see, that was success, because what you did automatically was yeah, but I'm over here now. And that, and it's like, okay, but then can I relax that expectation? Because that's all preconceived expectation, which is what the left hemisphere does, because it has linearity across time. And now I'm chewing on this, and I want to chew more on this. And it's like, well, that's important. But now that that's turned on, let's turn on this other part and help you recognize that you can dissolve this by choice, but I might be pulling you up out of it in order to have this other experience of being. And I don't use the word spirituality. I don't call it, I don't go foo-foo, but the fact of the matter is we have foo-foo wired inside of us if that's what the left brain is going to label the experience of being connected to all that is. At this point, it becomes language and judgment. And language and judgment are both in that left hemisphere about what the right hemisphere experience is. So I think anybody that shows resistance to, the woo-woo or the foo-foo or the whatever, it's all too soft, it's like, well, that's your stuff. That's language that you're using on an experience inside of yourself that actually allows you to shift out of me, the individual, into the collective whole. Now, are there people who exemplify a woo-woo that turn you off? That's fine. I'm not an advocate for those people. What I'm an advocate for is your ability to actually experience without judgment your own connection to the universe where there are no boundaries, because realistically, as a biological creature, you are of that. That is in you at all time and completely accessible. And that's where your peace actually lives. So if you want to find yourself at peace with yourself, this understanding of yourself, taking your individuality less seriously, is an important tool.
Yes. Oh, okay. That there is exactly what I needed to hear. So if I go through some of these statements, then there's other people who are maybe category 1 dominant right now, and they're hearing this, and they're getting the dash of woo woo that's maybe starting to freak them out, and there's going to be some biologists out there who might be spitting their tea out as we go through this. I'd love to unpack some of this. We've got
and let me say, because you said that, let me say this: the scientific method. And I'm a trained neuroanatomist. I mean, I'm as hardcore can be when it comes to that kind of thing. At the same time, the scientific method is a method. It is a structure that scientists use in order to be able to explore something with as tight variables controlled as possible. And it has a beginning and it has an end, and it needs to be reproducible. Well, that's great for anything that is left hemisphered, because the physical world we can generally control in those ways. So the scientific method, by definition, is a left hemisphere tool that we can use. But how do we use a left hemisphere methodology and repeatability for things that we can't explain and yet we know exist in the universe? And there are scientists who are now using like functional imaging to figure out, okay, well, when we talk about energy, and energy was a taboo subject, when I was in college, because unless you're going to talk about the energy of the mitochondria, you can't talk about energy when we all know we're influenced by energy. So unless you're talking physics, it fit into that package because the scientific method needs the packaging. So all we're doing here is we're looking at the different parts of the brain, and we're looking at the skill sets that those different parts of our brain permit us. And we know we have intuition. How do we measure intuition? We use the left hemisphere tools in order to be able to measure someone's intuition, or quantum physics. Now, I mean, how much sense does that make to left hemisphere? So there is a population of science and person that is resistant to the collective whole experience of the right hemisphere, and they want to fight that. all the way from the woo, 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 woo into the, the network of what is real at a neuroanatomical skill set level. So just saying that we're all going to fit somewhere in there. And if you find yourself really rigid, you might want to really consider what's going on in the present moment of the skill sets. Study people with stroke or lesion studies of that right hemisphere to realize what's going on in there, or people who lose the left hemisphere, what is actually going on in the right hemisphere, because it's very different than what's information is processed in a different way than in actually the opposite way as the left hemisphere.
Yes. So even there, like one of the quotes here is that the consciousness that we share with others on all other life, it was very much that thinking part of the right hemisphere is a portal of the universe that enters into and fuels every cell in our body. So that there almost implied that okay, consciousness is outside of the brain, and I know that not that we're going to explore the hard what do they say, the hard problem of consciousness, but that thing, did that not? Just
let's go there.
Okay.
Let's go there. Okay, so if I'm an organism, which is all I am, right? I'm an organism, you're an organism, we're made up of approximately 50 trillion cells. 50 trillion is a lot of cells, right? So let's go down to the single cell. Let's go down to the microbe. The relationship that the single-celled microbe has with the world, the universe around it, is separated simply by a semi-permeable membrane. Some things go in, some things go out. There are receptors, so it receives information of certain things, and it doesn't receive things that it doesn't have receptors for. Well, we, as big 50 trillion organisms, we're the exact same way. We have input through our sensory systems. We have output through our different motor system or our language system or whatever systems. And we are attracted towards certain things, and we repel against certain things. We have sensory systems that pick out very specific information that will come in. And I'm not going to pick up infrared, right? Because I don't have a sensory system for it, and neither are you. So here we are. We're simple organisms, and then as a mammal that is going to reproduce through an egg and a sperm, the DNA gets combined, but that original zygote cell has all the genius that it needs in order to multiply and divide its DNA over and over and repackage itself over and over and over and over and over again at a rate of as high as 250,000 cells per second. 250,000 cells per second. So what is the fetus? The fetus is this energy ball and this matter that is being multiplied and duplicated and repackaged until boom, now it's ready to come out of the womb and it's in the world, and now it's going to grow up into, it's going to develop over time into a new person. So the consciousness of the energy that multiplies and divides and multiplies and directs all of that is that consciousness. Is there a consciousness about that? Or is it just the atoms and molecules? Well, how do atoms and molecules move through space? Through energy. I mean, atoms and molecules can lay in a rock and they're not moving much, right? But in life, in cellular a multiplication, there's energy. And so if that single cell had the consciousness, the energy to build itself, well, where's that consciousness come from? That consciousness has to be the consciousness of the energy of the universe. Now, some of your people might be freaking out going, wow, this chick is way off. But it's not. From a biological perspective, that's the difference between being alive and not being alive, is the energy. And is that energy conscious? Well, regardless of whether it is or not, it is in every cell of our body, because it begins in that single cell that then multiplies into what I am. So that means the consciousness of the universe is in every cell of my body. And if it's in every cell of my body, then I am swimming within this sea of electromagnetic radiation, which we all know that we are anyway, and that influences what's going on at the cellular level inside of our bodies, which is how disease happens, right? When cells get cut off from the bigger energy flow inside of the system, then they go haywire and they're no longer being controlled. And cancer cells grow and they multiply and multiply and multiply, and that's a whole other story. But so I think that kind of addressed that the consciousness of the universe inside of ourselves. But I'm a completely non-functional organism if that's all I am, right? I have to have an analytical brain in order to be a human. I have to have an emotional filter of processing information if I'm going to be a mammal. I have to have a way of organizing my experience, past and future and present moment, in order to have a relationship with the present moment, have a past, have a future. So it's just all in the basic anatomy of the brain and the nervous system.
Okay. And why though does that consciousness need to start from outside of it? I mean, I'm a guy who lived in a Buddhist temple for 2 years, so I'm very familiar and love the concept of oneness. But I have always wondered, why is it that something external of the body has to be responsible for forming that conscious experience?
Well, the universe, if you just look at the energy of the universe, right? Forget life, forget humans, forget single cells. There's a tendency in the energetic of the universe to create order from disorder.
Okay.
How does that even happen? Why does that even happen? It happens. You put a bunch of particulate matter together, and eventually, and there are all kinds of beautiful things on YouTube showing this, the way that this happens. And part of that is, you have to consider that particles are magnetically charged. There's positive charge, there's negative charge, there's more positive charge. Different molecules have different magnetic polarities, and that's, and they're dancing, and they have this motion. And even in Brownian random motion, how random is that Brownian motion? Because somehow it creates order. So if that is what is out there, whether it's a consciousness or not, it's certainly not like I'm thinking, hey, I like eggs, right? Or I like the color red, right? It's not that level of consciousness, but it still is having relationships and patterns established inside of particulate matter. And so eventually particulate matter constructs into some kind of RNA. Let's start there. And these are just atoms and molecules, and it's like a virus. And a virus then is this, there's some level of consciousness inside of this virus that directs its behavior toward a host to take over the machinery of the host in order to multiply itself, to make more of itself. But it itself is not even a cell. It's simply RNA. It's simply atoms and molecules, right? That's all that it is. So it doesn't even have a package around it. So then you go to the next level of complexity. If you take a DNA and you wrap it up in a semi-permeable membrane, and you create these little organelles, then you have this DNA inside of the mitochondria. Well, maybe a mitochondria was nothing more than a virus, and then the virus created its own packaging so that it ends up being a single cell. And when you go back and you look at the maternal DNA on the planet, there's only like 5 strands. Well, where did that come from, right? I mean, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. All I know is that there's this wonder of life that happens. And in life, there is this tendency toward order. And as that order happens, even with that single-celled molecule, it's kind of like the meaning of life is to stimulate and be stimulated by. And if I'm just a single-celled organism, some things will stimulate me and I'll be attracted toward, like, let's say, photons or hydrogen atoms. Too much of that acid, I get repelled away from it. So I end up doing this dance as a biological, and then ultimately I want more stimulation, more dance with the universe, but my surface area is too big. Now I can't get bigger because I'm going to explode. So I multiply, and now there's 2 of us, or now there's 18 of us, or now there's 50 trillion of us, and we're still doing the same dance of consciousness.
So just so I understand this, Jill, because I this is, by the way, I'm loving this, by the way, but just so I understand then, would it be possible, just because I feel like consciousness, especially nowadays, is it's almost a loaded word the way that God is, right? When people talk about consciousness, could you replace the word consciousness with the direction of the universe?
The
So
direction.
could you replace that word with direction, in the sense of that the universe seems to have a direction in the way that it does things,
Yes.
and so the direction as to what it wants to do here, as opposed to it's the same sense of awareness, it's more the overall direction as to how the universe flows. Could we replace the word consciousness with direction? Would that still work?
I think essentially you're talking about intelligent design,
Okay.
which is one of the ways of talking about the consciousness of the universe. Is there an intelligent design? And you either recognize or accept that yes, there is, and that the design is toward more order, or you don't. Then creationism and all these different belief systems in what's actually happening in all of that. But I think so. I think. But direction does not imply, well, maybe it does imply a knowing. I think that God, quote quote, God is a knowing for some people.
So that
Higher
knowing.
consciousness, a knowing. Pardon me?
Okay. So that higher consciousness, that knowing, again, there's lots of people who would say, no, it's completely random, and actually over a long enough time span, everything moves more towards chaos than they would order. That would be the opposing argument.
I think they might want to look that up.
Really?
I mean, there are all kinds of stuff, even on YouTube, about how Brownian movement, the randomness of Brownian movement is not random. And especially for some of the physicists who have applied mathematics to it. I mean, it's it's an interesting subject. I encourage people to go explore that.
So with that, then, just before I ask my last question, when people say that they have things, so I'm very conscious of your time. I know I didn't get much, so I wanted to squeeze as much juice as I can out of our conversation. When people recount things like near-death experiences,
when they say that again,
when people have NDEs, near-death experiences,
yeah, okay,
and sometimes people have these wonderful healings occur, sometimes extraordinary realizations. Do you think that their sense of awareness is going into another field, or do you think it's just a byproduct of different aspects of the brain starting to shut off?
Well, I don't see us as separate from the universe. So, you have this separation. Oh, why does it have to be inside me or outside of me? To your right brain, there is no separation. Yes. Your cells are being reprocessed pretty much every 2 to 3 weeks, virtually everybody. And for the cells that are not being reproduced and repackaged and renewing, the atoms and molecules of our neurons, which are ours for most of our lifetime, but it's not like it's all the same construct. Parts have been dipped out and dipped in. We're constantly refreshing ourselves with the atoms and molecules of the universe. So I don't see energetically a separation to say consciousness is outside of me or inside of me, because I'm not separate from that energy. I am that energy. I am in the sea, and the sea is in me, if you will. It's all one thing. So for me, okay, I'm sorry. I went somewhere else. What was your question? Take me back to what specifically you wanted me to go with that.
I think an even easier question would be, did you believe in that higher consciousness / intelligent design, innate intelligence before your stroke, or did it take you having that experience to recognize that now that I felt it, I just can't not know it?
Well, first of all, pre-stroke, I saw spirit. I would have said, if I had to pick a religion that I was closest to, even though my father was an Episcopalian minister, I resonated with American Indian philosophy, and that we are all connected, and that the decisions we make should be not just based on the profit for myself, but the profit for all of us as humanity. And so I was a very right-brain child. I was very athletic. I was musical. I was creative, artistic, I was permitted by my family unit to be that, because I had a brother who was so left-brained, who would ultimately be diagnosed with schizophrenia, who was winning all the awards and climbing all the ladders. So he was their intellectual satisfaction as parents, and I was just off enjoying my life, right? And then my poor mother wondered if I was ever going to turn on my intellectual circuitry, and because I was like, I was just about the play and the adventure and whitewater river rafting and, sports. And, I was all that. It was like, you have intellectual capacity. Is it ever going to turn on? And so when I went to college, I fell in love with the subject of anatomy. And it was then that left hemisphere of mine took off, and it became, what it should have been based on my mother and father's intellectual capacities. So it turned on really well, and I went off and I started becoming a neuroanatomist and doing everything left brain people are supposed to do. And I was running amazing research, but I always had this right hemisphere. I still did music. I still did art. I still did sports. I was a healthy human being. So I was pretty whole brain before the stroke happened. And then when the stroke happened and it wiped out my left hemisphere, I was okay with that. It didn't matter that I fell off the Harvard ladder. It didn't matter the ego cells were gone. And oh my God, look what happened to Jill. It was like, I was fine. And I thought, okay, well, I'll earn a living now landscaping yards because I really enjoy yard labor. I was okay with that. But then the left hemisphere got rebuilt, and I literally used my own right hemisphere to rebuild those circuits in the left hemisphere to bring it all back online. And then I threw myself back into volunteering at the medical school for gross anatomy, because that's what I was teaching, to teach again neuroanatomy, because that's what I had been teaching, and to relearn my science experientially and rebuild that circuitry. But now I know I'm a part of the flow. I mean, I'm really clear that I have these two very different ways of being. And I know that I'm probably one of the most peaceful, healthy, happy people on the planet, taking responsibility for what I let into my life and what I put out into the world, because I'm living a whole brain life. And I recognize the power that we all have to achieve this. And whole brain living is the, how I've packaged it in order for other people to gain a resonance with the beauty of what they are. So I would say to anybody remotely interested in finding deep inner peace, I'd explore whole brain living. And I'd also say to anybody who resists whole brain living, it's more palatable when you put it actually at the anatomy of the brain. And I think that they will find that at a neuroanatomical level, it makes perfect sense. And wow, we do have the capacity to expand and learn and grow.
Yes, I know. I completely back that up. They're both books that I couldn't recommend highly enough. Like I said, there's only a handful of books in the world that have really been a game changer for me, and I would have to put both of those together and say that they were easily in the top 5 books that I could say, wow, that there was before those books and there was after those books.
Wow.
So Jill, thank you so much for that gift. My final question is, I remember hearing you say it before, that I used that part of my brain to help heal the other parts.
Right.
And in the book, I know that you also spoke about different exercises that Gigi would really push you to do to be able to turn that back on.
Yeah.
What do you mean when you say that you allowed, or you used that hemisphere, or used that part of the brain to be able to heal the other part?
Well, first of all, I had the advantage that I had been, I knew what I lost, because I essentially became, in many capacities, on the autism scale, because there were certain things that I could do really, really well now because they were no longer inhibited by the left hemisphere. And one of those was 3-dimensional visioning. And because I had been a gross anatomist, body anatomist, I taught cadaver lab for, 15 years pre-stroke. And then, so I had a 3-dimensional understanding of the body and how the body is put together. And I had been teaching, first year medical students cadaver lab, And I was always about the experience. Put your hands in there, close your eyes, and feel the relationship between the back of the stomach and the pancreas and the spleen and the kidneys and the liver. Feel that. Get a three-dimensional feeling of what that's like in there, so that it's really yours. And it's not just your intellect saying, okay, here's the stomach, and then behind the stomach is going to be these blood vessels, and they're going to be doing this and all of that. So we learn both ways. We learn experientially and visually, auditorily. We learn language-based. Well, when I had the stroke, I lost all my language. I had no language, zero, silent mind, boom, nothing. So I had to relearn all vocabulary again. I had to relearn my sciences again, the terminology. I mean, I could have sculpted, because I still had the right hemisphere, I could have sculpted for you a stomach, a human stomach, but the left hemisphere that says we call this part this part that, this part that, terminology was gone. So I took the three-dimensional understanding of my expertise, and also I was a neuroanatomist. So I taught neuroanatomy, the anatomy of the brain, and there's a lot going on in there, that little space, right? The anatomy of the brain. So I had the three-dimensional understanding of all that circuitry. I just had to put the language back on it. And so in order to rebuild that circuitry, rebuild that knowledge, I used what I knew I had lost. And what I had lost was the terminology for everything that I had known. I just learned I lost language, right? And I didn't care that I lost being a solid and that I was now a fluid. I liked that. I loved it. Actually, for 8 years, I got to live as a complete fluid in a fluid environment, which really reminded me of what I had gained from having this stroke experience. And then eventually that group of cells that defines the boundaries of where we begin and end in that left parietal region came back online, and it's like, oh my God. And I was water skiing, and I realized, oh my God, I'm a solid. And if I hit that water, it's going to hurt. And that's a completely different experience from skiing and being at one with the water. And if you wipe out, you just roll with it, right? It's like, no, boom, all of a sudden there's going to be pain. So I realized in that moment, I have completely recovered. It was really funny, but it was like an instant awareness. Oh my God, I have completely recovered. And so then it means, okay, go and finish the recovery section of my stroke of insight, because now I have recovered. And you can't write about recovery until you've recovered, right? Yeah. So things take time. And so, but that's what I did. I used what I knew, and I used what I knew I had lost, and I redirected my learning very specifically so I could rebuild those skill sets. Well, in our human society, if we don't have language, we are on the sidelines of life. So learning language became a top priority for my mother, because, you read language. First of all, you have an alphabet. Well, what's an alphabet? And this is just for reading, right? It's a bunch of squiggles oriented in very specific orientation, and they have sound. Well, that makes no sense whatsoever. I'm sorry. This is, Gigi would say, this is an S, and she'd draw me an S. This is an S, and it sounds like S. And I would look at her like, honey, who lost their mind here? I mean, this is the ridiculous thing I'd ever heard of. And it was hard work. And then it's like, well, is this an S, or is this an S, or is it just this an S, right? It's very specific. Language is very specific. And that's just for writing and reading it, but speaking it and building a vocabulary and being able to communicate rapidly with people. It's like, it's a horrible experience. Poor children. I mean, really, who cares for this? I thought to myself, who cares for this? This is a horrible experience. My brain did not want to do it, but we forced my brain to do it by practice. And then we put me to sleep, right? Because anytime you work and to learn anything, you have to counter that with sleep, because those cells are eating and creating waste, right? So you got to clear it up if you're going to have any clarity for learning. So anyway, I only had so much energy. I could learn something experientially in order to get my body, which the right side had become paralyzed, in order to rebuild the cellular body relationship, or I could put that energy into an intellectual pursuit. But I was limited. I had to choose, and I had to figure out balance, and it took 8 years.
Yeah. Wow. Well, Jill, this has been so much fun. I am so glad we got to do this. If people want to learn more about you, find out more about you, where on earth should they go?
drjilltaylor.com. I'm so easy to find. Go to the YouTube. They're all people, I like talking to people. I love applying whole brain living to different people's area of expertise. So the conversation I just had with you is very unique to you and what you would care about as far as the brain and whole brain living and my stroke of insight are. So they're all pretty different, even though they all come right back around to whole brain living and the 4 characters that drive our life, because that's what they all have in common, is the anatomy of the brain.
Perfect. I'll be putting links to the TED Talk, both books, in your website in the show notes. Jill, thank you ever so much for coming on again. It was great.
Scott, it's been a delight. Thank you for inviting me.